So I'm talking about advanced testing in Ember, which could mean so many things. And so I'm Katie Gengler. I live in New Jersey. I'm responsible for Ember Observer, Ember Feature Flags, and Ember Try. I run a small consulting company called Code All Day, just me and a partner, and we primarily do Ember work. So what's advanced testing? I've been asking everybody, and nobody seems to know. So, is it TDD? But Torin's got that covered. So I don't really know. So in that case, it's going to be some assorted techniques that I've used in testing Ember apps. I always have a large test suite with every Ember app I build. But it might be unusual in that my test suites are almost entirely, at least for the Ember apps, are entirely acceptance tests. Almost entirely. I'll unit test something that's like a little function that's got a lot of logic in it. I try to pull it out into a separate helper, so I just isolate just that one thing. Unit test some services, but I hardly ever unit test controllers, components, models. And the reason I prefer that is that I think it's a flip around from the traditional testing triangle where it says you should have fewer UI tests and many, many unit tests. And I find this gives me the most bang for the buck in Ember apps to flip that upside down, because the acceptance tests are not that slow, and it lets me drive the app from the perspective of the user, which I find much more valuable, because a lot of Ember development is just about wiring different layers together and not so much about necessarily crafting object-oriented special objects or a lot of algorithms or behavior that usually is not common in most Ember apps. It's more about UI, behavior, UX, various animations, and that's the stuff that you want to ensure you don't break. And so it's really nice to have a suite that can catch that kind of stuff. Just this past week on a client, we had to make a change in a refactoring change where we removed a whole bunch of components and moved them around in prep for moving to Ember 2. And because we only had acceptance tests, almost none of our tests had to change. And that actually gave us a nice safety net, because otherwise we'd be wondering, we'd be changing the test at the same time as the code and moving it around and changing it, and it would feel a little nerve-wracking because you wouldn't know, did I just change the test to make the code pass? Or did I just change the test to make the test pass? Is it testing anything anymore? So that's where I get the most value. I put a little flag for end-to-end testing here because I find the need for end-to-end testing between my Ember app and whatever the back end is. The API can be fully covered, it goes to the back end, the Ember app can be fully covered, but it's really nice to have at least one or two smoke tests that go across the both. And unfortunately, I'm not going to go into details on that today, because thus far I've not seen a way to do that well that works for any app. You need to find your own solution for that. So since I prefer acceptance, not surprisingly, most of these techniques are around acceptance testing. So the first thing to note, and Liz brought this up a little bit, is that Ember tests are async, and Ember acceptance tests are fake synchronous. So this looks like it's going to be synchronous code. It looks like visit run, let's go. I didn't realize clicking would bring me forward. I'm trying to point things out, but I don't know if you can even see my mouse pointer. So it looks like and then comes right after visit, but it won't. It's going to wait for everything that visit causes to happen before and then gets run. And if you had a statement between here, it would not get run in between visit and then necessarily. It would get run right after var add-on probably, or right after visit is called, but not necessarily the end result of visit. And so this is really a chained promise with these things, and then sometimes you can intersperse things, but they're not happening where you think they're happening. And I think that's something that trips up people a lot with Ember acceptance tests, is that they think things are happening in between these two. I know a lot of times I end up slapping my head after an hour or two of debugging and realizing I've forgotten, and then maybe that's an argument in favor of Mocha, as Charles said. So, in this next slide, so if I put this function here, call this function that sets up data for the next page, it's not going to get called between, after the visit completes and before the click starts. It's going to get called after visit gets called, which is not necessarily after visit completes. So it essentially might not get called after, the app may not be set up. And in the same thing, click is not going to wait for a function that sets up data for the next page because it has no idea what function, if that in turn turns off something asynchronous, it's not going to wait for it. So what you can do is you can wrap it in an and then, which puts it in the sequence of the fake sync testing. And another thing you can do is create a async test helper for this to do this. And so Ember-G test helper setup page, and then you have this test helper, and it could do something like set data in local storage or other data store that cannot be mocked with Mirage. Mirage is my preferred tool now for mocking APIs and setting up data in acceptance tests as much as is possible, but it doesn't always work for all different data stores. Some are complicated and some are not RESTful. So it could, this could set data in local storage or another data store. So let's see, async. So, and then once you have that async helper, you can just call it just like any of these other async helpers. Visit or click are also async helpers. They're just provided by Ember. We've now made our own setup page that is, once visit completes, setup page will be called. Once setup page completes, click will be called. Another thing you can do to accommodate asynchronous behavior in your tests or in your application is to register a waiter. And taking a step back from this, so any Ember asynchronous, that async test promise and deciding to go move on is aware of a lot of asynchronous behavior in app, but it's only aware of asynchronous behavior in app that is known to Ember. So anything wrapped in an Ember RSV promise, it's aware of the run loop, it's aware of a few other things, it's aware of jQuery Ajax, but there's some things it's not going to be aware of. So if you're using a different style database, you might want to check if there are any current transactions and wait for any transactions to complete. And Ember might not be aware of this because it might be a third-party dependency, it might be an interesting integration with the backend, you never know. And so going into more about registry, I hope this is just a wall of text, unfortunately, but it's so hard to fit this all on a slide, and pulling it apart doesn't make any sense. So this is actually from Ember Tooltips, an add-on I found, and they have this, there's another way to do a waiter instead of just a global waiter, because in this case the global waiter works because you have this global you can point to. But if you don't have a global and you need to get at some behavior in your app or wait for something, this seems like a really nice way to do this, is registering an async helper that wraps creating a waiter, registering a waiter. And so it's waiting, it's using jQuery to look for a tooltip being removed, and it's waiting for the mouse out. And I thought that was very, very interesting. I personally have not done this technique, but then the next technique I found in Liquid Fire, which is creating the waiter inside of your actual code base. So this is inside of a service inside of Liquid Fire. And it calls this .waiter, it registers the waiter when the init of the service happens. And this way it's able to look at its internal state. And so it's able to look if any transitions are happening and wait on those. And I think that I've used this technique and it's very useful so that you can get at states way inside your application when you're using something like Ember CLI and you don't have globals. And not that looking at globals were a good practice to begin with. So we're switching topics now, and we're now onto page objects. Page objects haven't seen a lot of publicity lately in the Ember community, I think because of a few add-ons that do it. So I'm just going to show you the test before and after a page object, a really simplistic page object because it's hard to fit this on slides. So it displays work in progress or score. So this is about Ember Observer, and it's, as with the other tests, I really probably should have walked through those. Oops. And we'll ignore this for now. It's visiting / and then it's clicking on test category contains stuff. And test add-on row contains new add-on 0. Then it's asserting contains score is work in progress. And so there's a lot of stuff here that in a test suite is going to be duplicated. There's going to be numerous times that we end up clicking on a category or an add-on by name. And so in this next one, and it's a little, I cut off most of the test because you would also want to put the assertion in the page object. So a very simplistic page object would just be creating an Ember object with methods on it, choose category and choose add-on. And now I just call page I initiate the page in my test, passing in assert so that if it did want to do assertions in there, it has access to that. And page that choose category, page that choose add-on. And this is an incomplete page item because page object because visit is still being done here. But that's perhaps okay if you're switching between page and the page object you're using relates to a page that is later. But mostly it's because it didn't fit on the slides. And so if we continued and we still had that assertion about work in progress, we'd want to also move that to the page object and have something like assert score is or something like that. And then it could use this .assert to do the assertion inside of that page object. There are two widely used add-ons for this, Ember CLI page object and Ember page object. I personally have not used them, and so I could not say which one is better or worse necessarily. For what it's worth, they both have high scores on Ember Observer. And, alright, moving on. So mocking. Mocking is somewhat an inevitable part of tests because you don't want tests to hit, say, third-party services necessarily that, say you had an email service, you wouldn't want it to actually send out emails to people. For most of it though, for an Ember app, you're going to want to mock your API, your backend API. You could run with your backend API running, and this is something about the end-to-end tests I mentioned, is that you can run with the backend running and then actually have some way of setting up data in the backend and making sure you can assert against that data in your test suite, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. So I really like Ember CLI Mirage, and I think a lot of people do. I've heard a lot of people, I think half or more of the questions in the Ember testing channel on the Slack have to be about Ember CLI Mirage. And I know it's undergoing a big development effort to get 0.2.0 out, which provides serializers and a lot more stuff that I don't even know about yet. Moving on from that, staying on this. So here's how you use Ember CLI Mirage, server.create add-on, name, you give data. The data is in the format that your server returns. And there's a configuration for this as well, but I know that there was a couple Ember global meetups ago about Ember Mirage, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. The point I really want to make here is that it's really nice to have your data set up in your test. That way you know what the state of the application is when you're making your assertions. Because if you just have one data set, you have no idea. If you look at a test, you have no idea what of that data matters to that particular test. And so we're putting here, we know that is work in progress true matters to this test. And we're testing that particular state. And this is another wall of text, unfortunately. So here I've got, this is to demonstrate overriding the Ember CLI Mirage config, which I don't know if I get asked about frequently. So in the config somewhere we have put invites 1, 2, 3, 4, or put invites invite ID. But in this particular spec, I'm trying to test that an invite gets saved multiple times and updated multiple times. And so I need to override the first one so that I can assert against the first save of it to see that the original level is saved as gold. So it's just an invite where you choose like which level you're going to sign up for or something like that. So you've responded to your invite. And the invite was previously saved before it was sent out. And so you respond and you say, I choose gold, but then you're on the page and you choose silver. And so when you finally save it, and this test submit, clicking submit down here is on this one line because it didn't really fit. So when you finally save it, it's gonna try to hit the server again and update it again. And so by putting this server.put in an in then, I'm able to replace the second request to this endpoint with a different set of assertions. And that's nice because now I can see that original level is gold and level is silver because that's changed. And another very important part of the slide is assert.expect for. If you didn't have this assertion, if for some reason these callbacks, these endpoints weren't hit, no assertions would run and nothing would know, your test suite wouldn't know that they hadn't run. And that's true of all things with asynchronous callbacks. You need to expect the number of assertions so that you know that if something stops running. Ooh, well, damn. All right then. With mocked window. All right. So sometimes you have to do a classic style of mocking. So this is a helper that I've used in an app recently. It's mocking window.open so that we can assert that window.open is called with certain parameters, because we don't actually want to open a window from our tests. But I guess that seems somewhat obvious. And so what I just did here is pass in the test function that does the assertions, so that when it gets called, you can say with mocked window open, these are the things that I want to do, and then pass in the mock that can have the assertion as well. Have the assertion in it. So the test function would have the activities. So you'd say visit / click thing that opens, and then the second object passed to it would be the mock of window.open. And so in there you'd have your assertion for what was passed to window.open. Great. So replacing a service and acceptance test. So this is something I've done a number of times, but unfortunately not recently. So I found this in the Ember Weekend app, which is a great place to look for examples of acceptance tests. And so it's calling something called Stub Resolver, which comes out of its own app, and you'd have to look at what that does. It does some things that are private. It uses the container. So I imagine that might be changing soon. But it's a good demonstration of being able to override a service in your acceptance tests that you have that you might not want to let it hit out to the local storage. You might want to mock player service. I see that there's assertions inside of here, so you might want to assert inside the service. And services are a great way to wrap third-party tools so that you don't have to. You can mock the thing you own instead of mocking a third-party API that might change, and then you can have the ability to assert against what you're doing with it. I encourage you to look at their tests. So dependency injection. I wanted to go into this a bit more, but I ran out of time preparing this, unfortunately. So I think the Mixonic, Matthew Veal's discussion of this from EmberFest 2014 is actually still really valid, except for some of the syntax of the techniques, such as replacing a service, that don't work anymore, unfortunately. But the concepts are there, and so dependency injection is so you can do things like mock this dependency instead of having to try to mock something that is internal to an object and getting at it with weird mocking libraries or spies and having a very brittle test suite. You have the ability to pass in your dependencies, and so then you can replace them in tests. It makes it easier to recombine your objects. So custom assertions. So I actually get asked this pretty frequently too, even though it's right on QUnit's site. So QUnit lets you just have QUnit.assert whatever you want and make it a function and pass it whatever you want, and then it's available on the assert that's passed all your tests. And so this is one I use frequently, called contains exactly, which looks at the text that you're passed and the text that is in a selector, removes the spaces to normalize them, and then in QUnit assertions you have to do a this.push, passing it a two things to compare, I think, are the result and what it should have been, and text. I'm not exactly sure. I've lost this one since I put this in here 2 days ago, unfortunately. So I would look at QUnit's documentation for what these are passed. Unfortunately, I've been using these helpers so long that I don't remember. Good for me. So here's an example of using the custom assertions. You can call assert.contains exactly with your selector and what the text you want it to be. And this is very useful. I thought this example, because I find contains exactly especially is very good when you have numbers. Because if you just do :contains, it could contain 13, but the number there could be 137 or 713. So pause test is a helper that is in Ember, and it's been there for about a year. And it's not in the guides, unfortunately. It is in the API docs. And so what that lets you do is it pauses the test where you put return pause test. And here I set config test timeout to something very large, because otherwise after a while it'll time out and it will no longer be paused. And here I have a little video of using pause test. Hopefully this is showing up okay. And so we've gone to the test, and it opens the Chrome that goes with embertest.server, but we don't have any of our plugins because it's in a new profile. So close that, open a new browser window, and now the test, you can see the test is paused, and it's paused where I did return pause, so I can inspect the state of the app at this point. Well, that stopped a little short. It was supposed to show you that I opened the Ember Inspector, and because I was in the regular profile, I was able to inspect the app with Ember Inspector. So Ember Try. Ember Try lets you test your app with different sets of Bower dependencies. And NPM support for different dependencies is coming soon. So here's the configuration for Ember Try, and you just set up a name of the scenario and the dependencies you want to vary. And right now these are just Bower dependencies. So I'm saying I want to change from my default, whatever is in my bower.json, to Ember 2.0 and Ember Data 2.0.0 for one of the runs of my test suite. Another configuration, you can set it to use things like Canary, Beta, and Release as well if you want to just keep testing against the newest Ember Canary. And here's another video about, this is me running Ember Try Test All. That was a little fast at the beginning, so nobody saw that. And this is running against a new work in progress version of Ember Try that I have. So at the end we'll see some nicer dependency, nicer results. And hopefully it doesn't just loop before we can see it. Waiting. There we go. So it will now print out your dependencies and the version that was used, so that you can see that the right version was used and your tests were running against what you think it was run against. Great. Oop, so that got messed up. So, Ember CLI sauce. So I had the chance to use this just this week, and apparently my resolution is not exactly the same as when I did this. At the bottom you see. So Ember CLI sauce lets you run tests against multiple versions. Well, Sauce Labs lets you run tests in multiple different versions of browsers and platforms in theory. And so I went to do this week for a client, and I was surprised to find and happy to find that the Ember community had provided for me yet again. And I was able to just do install Ember CLI sauce, and boom, it almost practically just worked. After that, I just had to get a sauce username and password, or username and key, and run Ember Sauce Connect, and then set up a browser. So I ran, my first thing I ran tests on an iPhone, which was pretty cool. And after that, when you're done, you just do Ember Sauce Connect and you're able to set it up. And there's pretty good documentation on the add-on, so I'm not going to go into the particulars here. Something I found interesting with that is that my goal there was to expose a bug I found in an app I was working on iPhone, on iOS only, and I was able to recreate it in a simulator. But unfortunately, I was unable to recreate it in tests. And so that's something I want to touch on, is that the events that are simulated in the test aren't necessarily exactly the same as events from users or actually on devices. And so you do need to do some manual testing of your app. Automated tests will not absolve you from the need to click around your app and play with your app occasionally. In this instance, I was bit by the bug where in iOS, a thing with a click handler needs to have a cursor of pointer in order to be tappable, which is so bizarre, but I'm sure people who do more mobile know more than I do about that. And I played around for probably the entire day trying to figure out how to simulate that tap and actually expose it in tests. In the end, I had to give up, unfortunately. And so what I'm saying is that acceptance testing is great. It's really great to be able to have a net that lets you refactor your application. But it's not the end all be all. You still have to use your app, and people using your app hopefully will also find bugs. And that is all I have, I think. Oh, actually, I have one more slide. This is a test runner that I've been working on to hopefully replace QNet's test runner. And this would let you, it would keep the app over on the right. So I don't know if anybody's ever been in an app that does scrolling or other weird things. So the app would be isolated from the test runner, and this actually would have the test runner would be in an iframe. The app would be in the main page, and so you would not be stuck. You would now be isolated from your application in the test. So for instance, in some of the videos that I showed, the styling of the QNet page was kind of messed up, and that's because the styling of my app actually styles body, which maybe that's a bad practice, but I'm not always the one responsible for styles. And so it's kind of funny. It'd be great to get these things more isolated. And that's, I say dreaming because I've had not very much time to work on it. All right, and that's it.
Jonathan has a question
Great.
about the test runner.
Great.
Does it run the test isolation?
Yeah, it runs the tests are in isolation they're in isolation from QNet mostly. I mean, there's still the QNet has to run in there to do assertions with your tests.
The styles run in isolation?
Sorry?
Do the styles run in isolation from the runner?
The styles are applied in isolation, yes, because it's an iframe for the runner. And
Okay.
so there's no QNet styles are not in your app, and your app styles are not in your QNet.
Awesome.
Yeah. But it's very early.
It looks like that's all the questions.
Great.
Thank you very much, Katie.
No problem.